Thank you so much to Kevin, Manoj, and Natalie for having me here. It's a real honor, and I always love coming to Canada and working with Canadian labor lawyers and other academics in Canada to get a different perspective on many of the similar issues that we deal with in the United States, but often with a quite different kind of political and political economic analysis. So the name of this is based on a book project. It's a monograph. I'm under contract with MIT Press, and the working title for it is Rethinking the Future of Work. I use that term for a couple of reasons. The main one is that has become the way in which people, the term that people in the US are using to describe all of the technologically driven changes in the workplace. Ranging from artificial intelligence to robotics to machine learning, sometimes blockchain, the use of blockchain, which is the technology that underlies most cryptocurrencies. And as you'll see, basically, I think that debate is far too simplistic in a bunch of ways, and that it doesn't do nearly enough to engage with both broader questions of political economy and how those are impacting work and workers' lives, and just questions of labor and employment law and how those are impacting workers' lives. So to start off, I thought I would lead with two different understandings of work and economic citizenship. And I'm going to leave what I mean by economic citizenship a little vague for now. I'll come back to it later. The first you could call, say, industrial populism. The two examples of this on the slide, the famous one, the person who's made this type of talk most famous in the US, of course, is Donald Trump. In withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, he said that the agreement would have caused lost jobs, lowered wages, shuttered factories, and vastly diminished economic production. So still, operating within a frame in which jobs are assumed to be industrial jobs. Good jobs are certainly assumed to be industrial jobs. And the way that we improve work is to keep industrial jobs around. And that globalization itself and free trade agreements are themselves significant threats to industrial jobs at this point. Now, strikingly, I think Bernie Sanders largely believes the same thing. And a lot of Democratic policymakers and the trades union movement in the US largely say the same. That's a bit of an exaggeration, obviously, but the quote from Sanders here is, I think, telling. He says, this was in his 2016 campaign materials, in order to improve our economy, he argued, we have to stop billionaires from sending our jobs to China while millions here are looking for work. So, why is this vision flawed, in my view? Well, one reason is that we have already seen an enormous decline in manufacturing employment in the US. That has been correlated quite closely with increasing economic inequality and with declining labor movement membership. I think all three are quite clearly intertwined, but you see part of it in the chart up here. In case you can't read, the red line is the share of income going to the top 10% of the distribution within the United States. The blue line is union membership. And obviously, as union membership has declined, inequality has increased. It's a very, very complicated story, but this is at least one data point on it. Here we see the long-term decline of manufacturing employment, both in absolute and in relative terms. It is leveling off a little bit, as you can see on this chart from 2010 to 2016. But where are workers today? Where are the bulk of workers today? They're in retail, they're in restaurants, they're in hotels, they're in building services. Jobs are being created for low-wage workers all over the place in the economy, particularly in our cities, but they're not being created within factories. Further data point for this is job creation by wage level over the past 30 years. And here again, you see significant creation at the bottom end of the skill and income distribution, and at the top end, very little in here. Okay, so how does the problem with the Trump-Sanders line is that it is focused on the working class that we had in the United States in the 1950s. It's not focused on the working class that we have in the United States today. The large, low-wage sectors, the workers who really need assistance from the state, are, as I said, fast food, retail, home health care, child care, and elder care, drivers, especially for taxis and for Uber and the like. All right, more on that in a moment. Here's the second vision, though, is what you could call technological utopianism. Our good friend Elon Musk of Tesla and the Boring Company and SpaceX Like a lot of others in Silicon Valley, is now predicting an enormous wave of automation in the near term, which will put tens of millions of people out of work, and is calling for a basic income as a core policy solution. I think that this vision is also misguided for a number of reasons. The most prominent is that I don't think that there is a ton of evidence that we are on the verge of a wave of automation of this sort, as I'll say in a moment. Another reason is that within Silicon Valley, at least, there is a very, very strong tendency to link together arguments for basic income with arguments for labor market deregulation. And I talk about this a little bit in the Boston Review piece. Here's a quote that Andy Stern, former president of SEIU, which is the largest service sector workers union in the country, Andy Stern put into his book on basic income, quoting a venture capitalist, that because we don't have a basic income, we need crutches like minimum wage and unemployment insurance, and we regulate the market in ways that discourages activity. So the technological utopian view says we don't really need to regulate labor markets in the ways that we have in the past. If we give workers a basic income, that will enable them to thrive and to thrive without having to enter the labor market at all, and will perhaps give them a bit more bargaining power in the labor market. I think that that argument is overstated. I can talk about in Q&A if you like. Okay, so two kind of flawed visions of economic citizenship within popular debates. And here's my argument, which I've already touched on. Both of these debates are sort of misunderstanding the application and the impact of technology on workers. A focus on bringing back industrial jobs disregards that industrial jobs have essentially already been automated. And there are other ways in which firms are using technology to gain a power and an economic advantage over workers today that are not really attended to by either of the groups in this debate. And that we need a different set of policies to protect workers and to really restore the promise of equal economic citizenship in the future. I'll flesh these out later on, but essentially we want to be thinking about extending employment-type duties up supply chains to reach real parties, the parties that really have economic power over workers who are often immune from liability under current law. Significantly reshaping collective bargaining structures, and using technology to ensure legal compliance. And so back now to what I mean by economic citizenship. I think of this as both a status and a set of norms. It's sort of a central idea in the book, to be perfectly honest, because I think it's broad enough to encapsulate a bunch of different phenomena that impact our economic lives, including both work and social insurance entitlements and other entitlements, even rights within families in the ways that the family law is set up, certain criminal law, aspects of criminal law that end up disempowering people in the market. So it's both a status and a set of norms in that regard. The status side of it is that the notion of equal citizenship implies that one has all the legal rights you need to really participate in economic life. And it also communicates a set of norms of equal and fair treatment. And here, what I want to say, the prior slide, I was talking about labor market reforms, but I think that we have to think of those in the context of broader reforms to our political economy and welfare state in order to enable a middle-class standard of living for a much broader swath of workers. So, kind of to put a point on it, what the industrial populists kind of think the way we rebuild a middle class in industrialized countries is by rebuilding industry. And what I'm arguing is that that's a fool's errand. But what we can do is rebuild a middle class by improving the low-wage jobs that we have in wealthy countries now. And the technology is, at this moment, both part of the problem and part of the solution there. Okay, so into the automation threats. Granted that there are a number of truly stunning developments within and around Silicon Valley right now that are changing the way that we work. So one nice example is Amazon's automation of their warehouses. And this, I think, highlights one of the patterns that you see in the implementation of technology into the workplace and production processes. Amazon had a problem. They couldn't really keep up with the pace of orders that they were getting. And they tried to design robots to go around and pick goods off of shelves. And they just ran into a whole bunch of technical challenges with that because the robots had to move around the factory or the warehouse. They had to be able to grab things off shelves. That was very difficult. They came up with a novel solution, which is rather than sending people or robots out to get the stuff off shelves, why don't we bring the shelves to people? And they developed an army of robots to do exactly this. One of them is at the bottom of the screen. It's literally carrying the shelf. So it can go back into an entire, basically a sort of library stack style set of shelves that contain goods, and bring a particular shelf to a worker who can then take the good off of the shelf. So both a promise and a limitation of industrial automation, right? We're remaking a production process, but not in a way that completely replicates a human's behavior or a human's activity in that production process. Here's a second nice example. So some of you may have seen that Google's artificial intelligence division has developed a machine that can play Go almost as well as any human player. We've had chess programs for a long time, obviously. But chess programs are a lot easier to develop because chess has a finite set of rules. So if you want to program a computer to play chess, you write an algorithm that essentially encapsulates those rules. That's why we were able to do it starting in the 80s, if not the 70s. Go is very, very different. It has only a few rules, but it has a number of possible moves and strategies that are vastly greater than the number that can be used in chess, given the size of the board and the complexity of the game. How did Google deal with this? Well, they programmed a machine with the basic rules, but then let it play tens of millions of games. And over time, the machine essentially programmed itself on how to win the game against either human or artificially intelligent opponents. And when the very, very sort of striking and telling anecdote from this event where the Google's AI played a human player, because Go has so many different possible permutations on the board, there are national and even regional styles of play, right? You learn to play from a certain person and within a particular community, so there's a national style of play. Google's AI was not constrained by that. It didn't learn to play in any particular nation. It essentially taught itself. And so others who were watching this play out said it was like watching an alien intelligence. Essentially, it was doing things no human would ever think to do because they're so far outside the norms and just understandings of how the game is played. It followed the rules, but it ended up beating an extremely strong player by programming itself to play the game. I guess one more. So this is a form of artificial intelligence or artificial intelligence light that today is called machine learning. Training a computer or machine on reams of data so that it can detect patterns in that data and even develop algorithms to process it on its own. This is in part the engine behind autonomous vehicles. So rather than programming a vehicle with the rules of the road, a lot of the companies that are trying to develop autonomous vehicles are gathering data from actual trips taken by human drivers and then allowing autonomous cars to draw on that data to try to understand how best to drive. One of the downsides of this is that the algorithms themselves are often not even intelligible to humans, right? Because the algorithms and the rules of thumb that machines end up developing are sort of self-designed by the machines. Human programmers, have not actually created them and often can't, we can reverse engineer them a bit, but we can't quite follow them in the way that we could a standard algorithm. In any event, this is part of the machinery behind automated vehicles. Okay, a lot of people fear that this process the processes of automation and data analytics I'm laying out are going to lead to extensive job loss. So this is from a venture capital firm. Cashiers, they say, will be eliminated. Stock clerks and order filers, retail salespersons. A lot of people, especially in Silicon Valley, even see a lot of in-person services being eliminated. Dry cleaning, plumbing, landscaping, and cosmetology, right, hairdressing. I think I'll skip the law on this and come back. And I'll just say I'm not very worried about these jobs for a couple of reasons. So first off, Elon Musk, yes, is very worried that we're going to see an automation wave. He thinks this is happening. Elon Musk also thinks that we already live in an algorithm that was created by an artificially intelligent being. Literally, he has said this. He thinks it's more likely that we live in a computer simulation than what we live and breathe, right now is something that we would classify as real life. This is a pattern. If you dig deeper into many of the kind of trumpeters of a wave of automation, you find that they have a almost religious belief in the possibilities of technology. Some people have even kind of analogized one of the groupings within Silicon Valley for people following these questions as extremely akin to a religion. Okay, and I don't believe in making social predictions based on religious doctrine, just to say the least. Okay, reason number two is the dynamic effects of automation. In addition to the fact that the Amazon warehouse automation ended up, following a very different pattern than the one that we might predict, it ended up also boosting demand for labor elsewhere within Amazon's operations. Now, some of the, basically like the warehouses became more efficient, prices went down, more consumers came in, Amazon could handle more orders, and they had to hire 100,000 new workers. Some of those workers are coming at the expense of other retail outlets, right? There is certainly Amazon's putting a lot of pressure on traditional retailers in the US, but I don't think we know yet the extent to which, retail jobs, where at equilibrium, how many retail jobs we're going to have. But we can't disregard the sort of dynamic effects. Third reason is that the tech, as often as it's celebrated, we have to keep in mind it fails all the time. So IBM's Watson, they got access to the UK's National Health Service data in an effort to track sort of indicators within the patient indicators at an early time in their lives that might correlate with certain cancers or other diseases or syndromes later on in life. They also said that by incorporating Watson into cancer research, they would be able to spot and treat many cancers much better. They're nowhere on this project, according to people both internally and externally. An example from our field, Watson is also at the core of a legal research app called Ross. Are people familiar with that? Have you heard of it? Yeah. Which promised that you could do a natural language search for a legal question and get back a natural language memorandum. And there are some demonstrations of this, to prominent people within journalism and technology and law. And they got some law firms to sign up. It turns out that the raw memo that Ross was able to write was really, really, really bad. And the memos that were being given to law firm partners and the like had been written by people in a back room. So they were using, yes, Ross sort of made legal research a little bit easier, but it did not have anything close to the natural language communication capacities or the legal analytic capacities that, even a first year associate would. And another example I really like, if you train an AI to spot chihuahuas, sometimes it spots blueberry muffins. There's one or two on here that if you look at them really closely, you're like, I don't know if that's a chihuahua or a blueberry muffin. You have to, kind of take a second look at it. The AI doesn't know what a chihuahua looks like in real life. It doesn't interact with a chihuahua. It's getting better and better, but you can sort of understand, okay, maybe that's a chihuahua, maybe that's a blueberry muffin. Okay, fourth and final reason is just the necessity of tacit knowledge and things like extremely fine motor skills in so much of low-wage work today. Michael Polanyi is I'm not sure what his field was, he was Carl Polanyi's brother, described this decades ago, saying that we often sort of intuitively understand and feel things and are able to do things that we cannot communicate verbally. Now, this is in part an explanation for why it's so difficult to program a machine to play Go, right? And machine learning does get around it a little bit. But then an awful lot of jobs require not only that sort of judgment, but very fine motor skills, including all of these jobs, right? Doing dry cleaning, repairing a pipe, doing landscaping, these are things that robots are simply not well equipped to do because the tasks themselves differ from particular discrete job to discrete job. If you're changing a pipe, each pipe is a little bit different. And robots are great at doing the same thing again and again and again. They're terrible at doing different things. And even minor changes can really throw them off. David Autor, the labor economist from MIT, has a really telling example I just saw. We've been using robots to install windshields in automobiles for a very, very long time. No one is anywhere close to being able to create a robot that would repair a windshield or replace a windshield. Why? Because once you take a windshield out, you have to do all sorts of cleaning of the glue that was holding it in place, the gaskets that were in place. That simply requires very, very fine judgment about where things are going to go that robots are not able to do at this point. So, okay, in the future, the key distinction for purposes of automation, this is not my argument, but the breaking down of jobs into these categories is sort of my argument, is between tasks that are regular and tasks that are not regular. Regularized tasks, whether they are physical or cognitive, are very vulnerable to automation. If you have to count things on a shelf, that is vulnerable to automation, and Walmart is doing it right now. Factory assembly work is vulnerable to automation. But an awful lot of both low-wage and high-wage service tasks are far less vulnerable to automation. Landscaping, janitorial work, delivery of goods, this is a really key one. Even if we're able to develop autonomous cars that can get around from house, within a city, how are the goods going to get from the car to the actual door? You have to have a remarkably skilled robot to be able to navigate all the different types of steps and doors and everything else that people have. So I do not see, I don't see much risk of automation in these jobs. And if you look at U.S. Department of Labor data, it bears this out. We're continuing to see growth in these jobs year over year rather than contraction. We're continuing to see contraction in many of these jobs, not driving just yet, but we'll get there. So what does work look like in the future? Not many people doing regular tasks. I think that's already the case in the U.S., however. Continued demand in low-skill and high-skill non-regular services, as I said in the prior slide. And then tech often being used more to augment human intelligence than to completely replicate it. So a nice, just basic example for us, I think, is, Lexis or Westlaw, sorry, are those available in Canada? Yes, okay. Lexis or Westlaw, legal research tools, right? With some of the functionality of like a Google Maps added in. That's sometimes going to be, incredibly helpful and sometimes going to be just completely off. But it will make our jobs a little bit easier. We will still have to put the pieces together. I can talk more about kind of legal automation in the Q&A if you like. I've got some more thoughts on it. Okay, we should be worrying, however, about a broad category of things called human analytics. And what this includes is a number of different ways in which companies are using data practices to disempower workers. By monitoring them very closely, by automating management processes that give them fewer ways to appeal decisions within a company, and by remaking production processes in ways that tend to disempower workers as well. Let me skip over these, skip over that today. This is actually what I just said. So enhanced monitoring, algorithmic hiring, and reorganizing production processes. Let me walk through that. Worker monitoring, telematics devices are now regular in delivery trucks in the United States and much of Europe. These gather information on how quickly drivers are going, where they're turning, what routes they're taking, how quickly they're doing deliveries, and even whether they're wearing seatbelts. UPS implemented them 10 or so years ago and have been able to dramatically cut down labor costs as a result, because now they know, exactly when drivers were taking little breaks during the day, and they have cut basically all of those out of the driver's day. Drivers have also reported a higher rate of injuries because of a significantly higher speed of work. How much of that is attributable to, well, it's not, assuming the story I've just told is true, that's not the fault of telematics. That's what UPS has done to reorganize work using data that it gets from telematics devices. There's a sociologist at Cornell, Karen Levy, who has a book coming out on the way that technology is changing trucking that is really fantastic. Uber uses all sorts of much of the functionality in an iPhone to monitor what its drivers are doing. Are they driving too fast? Even what sorts of conversations are they having? And does this in order to ensure driver safety? But one of the other effects of this is that it gathers data on trips, right? It starts to understand what is the quickest way to get through a crowded city at a particular time. That's knowledge that taxi drivers used to kind of have, whether intuitively or explicitly, but they had it and no one else did. Once Uber is able to replicate that, the taxi drivers, any bargaining advantage they had because of that knowledge is no longer available, right? Handheld scanners and other scanners used for inventory purposes at many, many companies they're also can be used to determine exactly how quickly workers are processing orders. And you see this at fast food restaurants, including McDonald's and Burger King, at many retail establishments, including both goods stores like Target and Walmart and grocery stores. You can see exactly how quickly is that cashier moving orders through. Algorithmic hiring and management. This is quite interesting. A number of, it's not clear that it works yet, but the aspiration is the following. By gathering data on job applicants' social media habits, past purchasing habits and other online habits, we may be able to make predictions about their job performance. Not because they specifically say things about their job performance, but because you can discover correlations between things they have done in the past and job performance. There's a lot of press about this. I have not seen any good empirical studies of the extent to which it is a real thing. And some of the correlations that the startups advertise are fairly obvious. So, for example, one startup says workers who live more than 15 minutes or more than 20 minutes from work are much more likely to quit their job soon. Which doesn't strike me that you needed a very sophisticated algorithm to know that people with long commutes are likely to try to find another job. But in any event, there is a lot of companies are trying to use data analytics in hiring. Okay, this all leads into algorithmic management. So with that sort of data, how are production processes reorganized? This is a chart from Uber's patent for automatic matching of drivers and customers. That's work that was once done, if at all, by a taxi dispatcher, right? Now the data that Uber has on customers and drivers' location and its data on past rides and predictions of demand from those demand and supply in the near-term future allows it to do that matching without really any human oversight or intervention. So the whole field of taxi dispatcher is gone. Drivers themselves are still around, but dispatchers are taken out of the equation. This creates, I don't know, what are the net effects on workers is a little bit tough to tell. On the one hand, you can't appeal to an algorithm for a day off, right? And very similar processes are used at companies like Starbucks and Target for worker scheduling, right? Algorithms that simply try to determine demand at particular times and plug workers in at particular times. That severs part of the human aspect of management that may have given workers a little bit more or a little bit less bargaining power in particular instances. This is obviously being used for labor market intermediation in many other situations. One of the net effects of this, this is maybe not the best graphic for this purpose, is that with extensive data about production processes, it becomes less necessary, economically necessary, for firms to actually keep workers in-house. right? If you're able to know exactly, and give them formal employment protections, if you're able to know, if you're Amazon, for example, exactly how quickly your delivery contractors are completing orders, you have less of an incentive to, make them employees of the firm and actually give them good wages and benefits. Skip over that for now. And skip over that. So part of the story here is that data practices like these, they're getting a lot of attention in when it comes to Silicon Valley, but they're being used much, much more broadly. Okay, taking stock here. This is what I just mentioned. Many of these processes seem likely to make efficiency wages less necessary. And efficiency wages are wages paid above the so-called market rate in order to induce employees to give sound and very high performance. And the theory has long been that this is a device that employers use in situations where it's difficult to monitor workers. If that's the case, then it would seem likely that enhanced data analytics will allow observation of work effort much more closely, and firms will have less incentive to, either make people employees or pay them reasonably well. Again, you see parts of this all over the economy today. Uber and Lyft and FedEx and TaskRabbit, I'm sure you've heard of their use of independent contractors. I have McDonald's up here because it operates on a franchising model where McDonald's itself gathers and utilizes enormous amounts of data about sales within particular restaurants, and even screens employees or potential employees of those restaurants, but does not have any, it says it has no employment-related duties toward those workers, based upon the fact that they're employees of a franchisee. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, in a lot of instances, some of these practices could actually benefit workers, though this is largely a question of institutional design. So in Uber's situation and in some other situations, you see platforms actually consolidating markets that were heavily disaggregated in the past, which means that the party at the center of those markets, whether it's Uber or maybe you could say McDonald's, is a natural target for regulators and workers within those sectors, a natural community of interest for collective bargaining in the US. To illustrate that, this didn't come through very well. So these are all individual boxes. Right, this is the way the taxi market operated before Uber came into it. You have medallion owners, which is, this is New York, right? A license to operate a cab. Medallion is leased out to a management company who in turn leases those operating rights to a cab driver. There is no single party in this sector that has significant power to raise standards. There's also no party with monopsony power. But if you wanted to regulate the sector, you'd have to kind of either organize the medallion owners or the management companies in some way. There are tremendous transaction costs to doing so. Uber comes in. It says it doesn't have any employment relationship with its drivers. That's contested. But in some ways, maybe that doesn't matter because it has a direct contractual relationship with its drivers, right? And if Uber actually were forced through politics or law to change its labor standards, it could do so very, very easily. You wouldn't have significant, compliance or monitoring costs because it already knows how long drivers are on the road, how they're behaving, whether they've been on for too long, how much money they're making. If you imposed wage and hour liability on the company, it could ensure compliance quite easily. This is a chart I made for a new paper that tries to track this out. And so the left side is where worker protection is extraordinarily low, and the right side, worker protection very high. So both formal employment and unionization over here, pure independent contracting over here. And then the y-axis is the size of a company, which I use as a proxy for their technological sophistication. Here's the change within the taxi sector. It went from being unionized and relatively integrated in the 1970s to being quite disaggregated in the 2000s. That's the slide I just gave. So workers in the transition to going from driving for taxis to working for Uber and Lyft have lost a little bit of formal worker protection, but they're now proximate to a firm with substantial regulatory capacity in the Uber and Lyft themselves, which could raise standards if they desired to. This is in some ways a more interesting transition, and there's a good data coming out on this point about care.com, which is an online platform for nannies and other domestic workers. If you were a domestic worker, in the U.S., typically you have found work simply through word of mouth, and you were employed by an individual family. There's no technologically sophisticated party to the transaction. There's no oversight of the transaction by any corporation with a legal department of any sort. And so, you're way down here, working for a very small or non-existent company, and with basically no legal protections. Well, if you migrate to care.com, that dynamic changes quite a bit. All of a sudden, we have data on how long people are working. We have the possibility of automatic tax withholding. In care.com, there's some evidence is using that as a way to keep domestic workers on the platform and keep families on the platform. They would all have an incentive to simply go to, back into a cash economy once they find a caregiver on care.com. But to the extent that that platform actually handles those administrative responsibilities, it can be a major value added, both for the family hiring a caregiver and for the caregiver themselves. Okay, so what to do about this? Briefly, because I'm almost out of time. And this is where some of the suggestions are just going to follow from what I've already said. One is that I don't think that there is much to be done in the US to limit data gathering and usage, particularly in the workplace, given the structure of our privacy laws and given the productive efficiencies that companies very often claim. So the suggestion here is permit that so long as it doesn't violate privacy norms. That's like weaselly language, but we'll just live with that for a moment. But then rather than link duties to employment, enforce minimum terms through supply chain responsibility strategies, hold Uber to duties to its drivers regardless of employment status, and enforce that through the use of data at the regulatory level. And then push for what I and some other labor scholars in the US are calling social bargaining, which is bargaining between again at the supply chain level, but also between workers and all of the companies within a particular industrial sector in order to set minimum terms. So fast food forward, this is the big SEIU campaign to raise standards in the fast food sector. I'll give you a slide on this. This is what they've been pushing towards, right? Rather than organizing one Burger King or one Taco Bell, which is what you'd have to normally do under US and Canadian labor law for the most part, don't worry about getting a union. Get a social movement that can push those brands to actually set minimum standards and have them push the standards through their operations. You could encourage that through a couple of changes to US labor and employment law, which are at this point utopian, but I think at least worth thinking about. At least SEIU was doing this until, I don't know if you saw, the head of the campaign resigned amid extensive sexual harassment allegations. He was, the first big social movement person to be caught up in the latest wave of sexual harassment scandals. Proofs of concept here, Manoj and I were talking about some of this over lunch. The Bangladesh Fire and Safety Accord, which maybe or maybe not working all that well. And the Fair Food Standards Council, again, private initiatives that impose forms of supply chain responsibility. And then on basic income, as you may have seen in the Boston Review piece, I think that this is a great idea, all else being equal, but we can't make it a replacement for either broader social welfare benefits such as healthcare, housing assistance, childcare, and education, as many of the Elon Musks of the world want to do. And we have to continue regulating workplaces as well. So I would say have it supplement rather than replace other social programs, and think about much broader and substantial investments in physical and social infrastructure. I don't have time to go fully into it right now, but part of what I'm driving at here is to move the US towards something like a Danish flex security model. We already have extremely flexible labor markets. What we don't have are forms of security for either workers who are employed or workers who are unemployed. And to the extent that workers are going to be working with technology, we need to give even low-wage workers substantially greater skills than they already have. But that is a job, there are social policy ways to do that, such as substantial investment in education. This is what I think is missing from the UBI debates in the US anyway. They're largely about replacing welfare state programs and other regulations rather than supplementing them. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to your questions. Does someone want to keep a queue, or should I just?
I can keep a.
As you wish.
Okay. So I just wanted to come back to a specific point you were making about, I think it's the UPS drivers, and you sort of briefly alluded to the fact that the problem is not necessarily in the technology that monitors them, but the problem seems to be more about the incentives built into their terms of employment.
Yep.
And when I think of incentives that are given to employees, usually that links back to corporate governance issues. But I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about do we get too focused on the technology rather than the way it is used, and then the regulatory responses tend to focus on the technology, so the privacy problem rather than how we regulate the way those are used, and is the problem really in the incentive structure of the contract that was maybe always there, and technology just lets them use it, push those incentives harder?
Yes, I think I completely agree. If I'm understanding the comment.
I'm just wondering, then what is the regulatory response?
Right.
Is it a corporate governance issue, or is it a labor standards issue?
It's a labor standards. Hold on just one moment. I just want to come back. Where did this go? Part of it is I skipped over this slide earlier. This is the law of workplace automation. If you started to map out, what is the law of workplace automation, which is basically the same as the law of the implementation of technology into the workplace. If you're in a unionized, let me sort of give that first, then I'll circle back to the question. If you're in a unionized workplace, the implementation of new technology that substantially changes a job would be a mandatory subject of bargaining in the US, right? A union can bargain over it. They can eventually go on strike over it. They can likely then be terminated and have no remedy at all. But at least there is a transaction cost kind of built in the unionized sector. There are not, you don't, however, have rights to contest economically driven terminations. If jobs are simply eliminated through the use of technology, nothing, like big zero. And you have very, very few rights to prevent collection of data and the like. So, to come back to, what is the problem, right? It's not the use of telematics, or it's not the existence of telematics, it's the use of it in the context of an employment relationship in which workers have very few rights to contest more generally. Where the backdrop is employment at will, where they have very few privacy rights, and where they don't have many rights to bargain or contest things like the pace of work. So I think the broader regulatory response is to address some of those questions, especially around, for UPS, it's not minimum standards because the drivers actually make pretty good money. They're just being worked very, very quickly. But it's something like either bargaining or direct regulation over scheduling practices and things like the pace of work. And UPS is not a great example for this, but some of the other examples I gave are, it's holding companies to duties whenever they end up using technology in those particular ways. So what strikes me as a real misfire in the regulatory regime we have right now in the US is that a company like Uber is again the best example, but they're by no means the only one. A company like Uber can monitor its workforce extremely closely, but not be subject to employment-related duties. The regulatory response there is, I think, to either change the test of employment, which creates its own set of problems because that's extremely difficult to kind of deal with in litigation, or to just start imposing duties when a firm uses certain types of technology to monitor workers. At least I think that's a start. Does that get the question? Yeah. Yeah.
I want to push back a little bit on your some of your criticism of some of these Silicon Valley types. So, if I understand some of the argument correctly, a big component about this is about the nature of the type of work involved, right? Most complex cognitive tasks, they can be broken down into simpler tasks, right? An example, right? My brother's a doctor. The other day he was mentioning to me and my parents that there are already algorithms that can do a significantly better job than most humans at diagnosing a wide variety of illnesses, right? They can already do it way better. The reason they're not used is because there's a bit of an issue about, you know, who's accountable, et cetera, right? But, and lots of patients are uncomfortable with the use of it. Another example, there are already programs that can compose classical music, in some cases indistinguishable from, you know, some of the maestros, right? In Japan, there's a musician called Hitsune Miku, right? It's a robot, right? All the music is composed by a program, right? These are some of the tasks that are, you know, we would traditionally think of as not being amenable to automation, but clearly they are, right? And Go as another example, right? So Go is a task that, you know, fairly strictly delineated by a set of rules, right? But if you take a complicated task, you know, being a doctor, a lawyer, whatever, right? You can break it down. Maybe if you think of the occupation as consisting of a set of tasks, it might not be that the entire job will be automated, but you can see it slowly being chipped away, kind of thing. And I think that's a big part of what these people are arguing, right? It might not be that the fine motor skills involved with a carpenter, like right now, that doesn't look like something that's going to be lost, but you already see this happening in like accounting, for example.
Sure.
Right? A lot of programs are wiping away the need for basic accounting tasks.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. So a couple quick responses. One is, so in addition to accounting, think of inventory, right? It used to be that you had to have a person go through a store and count how many, you know, goods you had on the shelves. Taking theft off the table, that is now more or less automatic for many retailers, as I understand. Now, it has been for Walmart for a long time. At least Walmart has claimed that they are able to know when particular stores are going to run out of, you know, many goods well before the stores themselves know, based on purchasing patterns and, you know, just a brief look ahead at what's coming in the market. And so they'll do, you know, deliveries, but the stores themselves don't have to order goods for them to be delivered. Walmart itself essentially automates it. Okay, so but this is a couple of points where I think we disagree a bit. So one is, and I don't think you're doing this, but this is one of the challenges with a lot of the breathless reporting and Silicon Valley discussion of automation, is it runs together tasks and jobs. So there are tasks that we carry out within particular jobs, right? You know, sorry for like a dumb example, right? I'm advancing this manually using my thumb. I could presumably, we could have some device in my glasses, and if I wink my right eye, that could advance. That technology probably already exists, right? That is a task that I carry out in the course of a job. But jobs are made up of many, many tasks. The famous Oxford study that said 47% of jobs are vulnerable to automation was about tasks more than jobs. And if you look at McKinsey's studies on this, they've been doing, I think, quite good stuff. They again say most of us in our jobs have tasks that are vulnerable to automation, but very few of us have jobs in which all of the tasks are vulnerable to automation. So this is part of why I say it's intelligence augmentation rather than artificial intelligence, particularly in places like the professions. Now, I don't know the data on the medical tech side, so I don't want to kind of weigh in there. On law, Frank Pasquale, who teaches at University of Maryland and has written a lot on this, he's got a great paper about the automation of legal tasks. And if you looked at the history of technology and its use in law, you would see something like ever greater automation of particular tasks, starting with the invention of like the mimeograph machine and the copy machine, and moving up through LexisNexis and other online research databases, and then through things like LegalZoom, which is a company that allows you to kind of set up an LL or set up a company. It will basically design the documents for you to set up a company. It's largely automated. So that's all true, right? There are a lot of routine tasks that lawyers undertake. But the problem in law is what happens when the agreement breaks down, right? So we can automate a contract, but then let's say the contract is written by an algorithm that can't possibly take account of all of the different ways in which the parties' behavior may end up impacting the performance of the contract over time. But maybe most importantly, it can't. I just don't see any way to possibly automate a difficult legal decision in which you have, conflicting and irreconcilable normative values, right? Which is sort of every difficult legal decision. The law is a social practice that's been developed over time through people pursuing different normative visions of what the law should look like, and that's all baked into the law itself. So there's a legal realist side of this as well, right? And I think that points toward, the task of lawyers in the future will be things like client counseling, but then still understanding how to translate those ethical conflicts into actual, legal language. Yeah.
Brishen, I was wondering if I could press you a little bit to sort of elaborate on what your concept of economic citizenship is doing in your project. Because I think, it obviously invokes sort of that T.H. Marshall's idea of social citizenship, right? But that essentially is a descriptive term in that sense of
right.
What was going on in post-World War II European welfare states. Whereas, I don't see us having gotten to a stage at all where we think that political control over the economy is a viable or a good thing yet in the political sphere. So I was wondering, is it a political rallying call?
So I'll be sort of perfectly frank about it. I'm trying to come up with a set of ideas that can encapsulate a bunch of different legal, political, and social debates that are going on at multiple levels, within just public discourse right now. And economic citizenship strikes me as a helpful way of capturing kind of what's going on in those debates, in the sense that it's specific enough that I think people can get an intuitive sense of, or people have an intuitive sense of what it means to be an economic citizen, without necessarily being able to fully articulate it. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's kind of expansive enough to capture a whole range of things, including work, welfare, family, legal, classic national citizenship, and the like. So what I hope to do with the idea, and my thinking on this is not fully formed yet. I think you could cast the future of work debates that are going on in the U.S. and all of the debates that we're having right now about inequality, the stagnant job market, long-term unemployment, decreased social mobility on the one hand, and then the impact of technology and technology on the other hand, and maybe state policy on the third, kind of all being encapsulated within that. And I think a lot of people in the public debates are bringing a particular conception of economic citizenship to the debates with them. I highlighted two extremes at the beginning. They're the people who really just want to return us to the 1950s, and then the people who just think that work doesn't really matter anymore. So that's I think the clearest answer I can give right now. Flashing back to Marshall, right? It's a descriptive account of the way that participants in public debates in the U.S. at least tend to approach questions of what we need as citizens and what we owe each other as citizens on the one hand. But it's also, I think, I certainly have my own view of what good economic citizenship is, which is, I think, very broadly speaking, egalitarian, republican in nature, and that itself can inform a number of reform projects to advance a broad set of goals, including equality, autonomy, and sort of market and social freedom, if that makes sense. So in other words, it's purposefully a little vague and really broad, but that's part of why I'm attracted to it, because it encapsulates a bunch of different things. I'll also say, and again, flashing back to Marshall, I didn't talk about this in the talk, but in the draft, I'm getting into it. I think you can think about it as having multiple dimensions that track onto common reasons for regulating labor markets and other markets. So rights to enter on equal terms and anti-discrimination / equality principles are surely core, I think, to any reasonable conception of economic citizenship. A modicum of economic welfare, and so basic economic equality obtained through work and other means is also essential. And I think basic participation rights at some level are essential. You can think of those as like anti-discrimination principle, like distributive justice commitments, and then a kind of broader Republicanish autonomy commitment that I think can be woven in. Sure.
So I want to ask you to say a little more about regulating up the supply chain.
Yeah.
What you have in mind with that. It strikes me that there's a couple of issues that come up over and over again when these sorts of proposals are discussed. One of them is, what exactly are you hoping to, what capacities are you hoping to regulate? We talk about capturing the lead firm in the supply chain, for example, but that's a very broad description that can encompass a whole range of economic capacities that might be hard to define legally.
Mm-hmm.
The other question is, how do you define those capacities in a way that's workable legally, so we don't find ourselves with exactly the same kinds of problems as we have determining who is the employer in a Fisher workplace economy. We want something that's a little more manageable than that concept. So maybe too early to ask these questions in the project, but I thought I'd at least inquire.
No, I think it's. I think they're critical questions, and it is early, so my answer will be pretty hesitant. In terms of capacities, I think this is what you're getting at. I do, and correct me if not, I do think that the specific duties that we levy on lead firms are going to have to vary based upon the substantive entitlements at issue. So, minimum wage compliance is really difficult, but it's also probably the easiest one to get your head around. If a firm is purchasing goods and it has reason to know that they're being produced in violation of minimum wage laws, that ought to give rise to some sort of a duty. Or, I think better, simply a strict liability regime within defined parameters. Slightly more difficult case, collective bargaining. So, especially if you have say janitorial companies that are supplying a bunch of building owners in different industries, you might have a real estate investment trust as one lead firm, a private equity company that owns a hotel brand or owns a couple of physical hotels as another, and Walmart as a third. How do we define a community of interest there? I think it's very difficult, right? In that sort of situation, I think, so what people have worked out on the ground is you unite janitors across the board and sort of push the lead firms to take responsibility, but you're not exactly bargaining with the lead firms. You kind of bring them in as necessary and have relationships with them, but they're not quite folded into a bargaining unit in the same way. I think in fast food it's a little bit easier, at least if you're talking about line level fast food workers. Like, I feel like I can envision a national or regional bargaining unit of fast food workers that, encompasses all the fast food workers in, say, the New York City Metro or New York itself, and bargains, sits down with representatives of, the big fast food companies who then drive the agreement, through their suppliers. Questions like discrimination, sexual harassment get much tougher, and it's reflected in the U.S. law. So there's a case, Domino's Pizza. I think this was in 1 year. They were liable for unpaid wages to delivery drivers, but they were not liable for sexual harassment carried out by delivery drivers. There are certainly plausible arguments they should be liable for sexual harassment, but the reality is monitoring against sexual harassment is far more difficult than monitoring for unpaid wages. So I think it depends an awful lot on the sector and on the particular area of law under which we're regulating. I'll say one other thing, then come back to you because I think I may not have answered your second question. I think in practice you're going to have an administrative model for this, in which agencies are empowered to make these types of determinations and push companies into bargaining relationships or possibly impose conditions on a sectoral basis. There are, the NLRB, of course, does this with our labor law, but state departments of labor also have some power to impose conditions on a sectoral basis. The New York State Department of Labor just did it within fast food. It's not a unified labor law regime, but if you get that operating in a bunch of big states and operating within a bunch of the largest low-wage employers, you can start to make a pretty significant difference. Does that start to get at? Sure. Did I answer your second question?
To some extent.
Yeah, okay.
So the second question had more to do with how do you define these concepts in a way that doesn't get us bogged down in the same
right.
fact-specific determinations?
It's right. So the short answer is that there is, I think, no answer, honestly. Having wrestled with that one for a couple of years and tried to even draft model language that would do so, there's just so much heterogeneity in the labor market and from between sectors that no particular test is going to capture all of it. I suggested in a proposal that we start to, we give the DOL the power to make determinations of market power and to impose duties on that basis. So could the DOL say, look, McDonald's clearly has a lot of power, within this particular market. Sorry, they're not a good example. Walmart has a lot of power within this particular market. They should owe some duties to, the workers who are supplying their carrots. And the response from senior labor lawyers who'd been dealing with this was, if you put that on the table, we'd really worry that eventually we'd have to prove market power in order to get duties. And we really don't want to have to prove market power. We think we're better off, with the system we have now, as imperfect as it is, because it's extremely flexible, and with the right judge, we can tend to get decent results. So those types of reforms, when you start to kind of try to put them into practice, it can get very, very tricky. Hence an administrative solution that doesn't, involve a particular test. Yeah.
I had kind of like a two-part question.
Sure.
The first question goes back to the idea you were talking about how Amazon, they increased the amount of employment they had. I was just wondering, how were you measuring, to what base were you measuring the increase in employment? So in my mind, from that, sure, they've increased it by 100 million or whatever, let's say, or I don't know the exact number. Let's say they increased it by a certain number. The efficiencies that were created by simply having the shelves moving, that kind of decreased it in a certain way, so it wouldn't have increased as much as.
So right, yeah, it does. And the short answer is I don't have great data on exactly what happened in Amazon. That was based on a press release and a public announcement. They said, now that we've automated our warehouses, we have to hire 100,000 new workers. It opens up the question that I don't think I mentioned before, and you're right to raise, like how much of that was because of the warehouse automation versus other factors. They are continuing to hire across the country at a remarkable clip. Someone gave me the statistic. I should really track it down. He was actually worked for an insurance company that was working with them on their workers' comp policies. They have to insure 5,000. They have 5,000 new hires weekly, who are workers' compensation risks. So workers within warehouses and elsewhere, and they're doing that week over week over week. How sustainable that is and what effects it has on other retail in the long run is much tougher to say.
The reason I ask that is because let's say it was taking it away from other retail industries.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that it's not really an increase in the amount of jobs per se. Then in that case, like what role would you see the competition for like a lot of the people who are doing like lower paying jobs, I guess you could say? What role do you see the competition these people have in trying to get employment with these companies and their willingness to just have their privacy?
So is the question, what impact? Like, how does that impact the labor market or the workers themselves, or
if it's more competitive to get jobs at that with like less jobs, let's say, then how does that impact their bargaining power in terms of even getting anything?
Right. I mean, I think as always, there's what neoclassical theory would predict, and then what you actually see on the ground. So certainly, if you have a high unemployment rate and workers are desperate for work, they're very likely to sign away rights that they might otherwise bargain over. There's also all sorts of data and studies showing that workers tend to not really recognize what rights they do and do not have. And so if they're signing away certain privacy protections, they may not even be aware of that. More broadly, though, but then there's what happens on the ground. Amazon, the warehouse workers for Amazon, from what I can tell, are making decent money, but they have working conditions that are really not great. There's no, the warehouses are not well heated, they're not well cooled. There is a good number of, fairly high rate of on-the-job injuries. The jobs are physically demanding, and there's a good amount of turnover. They would be a natural unionization target if the US had a functional labor law regime, and presumably would be able to unionize pretty easily if we had such a regime.
We have time for one more, just a quick one. So I haven't read the Boston Review, but it's now front on my list. But I wanted to ask you about this universal, it's called basic UBI, Universal
Yep.
Basic Income. So I took your point about those who are advocating it kind of in place of or instead of labor market protections and or social programs. What exactly is your understanding or what's their understanding or how the relationship between that and this connects kind of to Priya's question to worker bargaining power? So, and how do you see it? And I just love to hear. Yeah,
I talk about it a little bit in the Boston Review piece. Though I had a longer discussion that we took out because it was just getting too kind of technical for a popular audience. So the way that you might think about this is that workers have what you call a reservation wage. There's a wage at which they won't work for less than that wage. And let's say the reservation wage is at this point, 0 in the U.S., right? If you, obviously, you have to be able to get to work, and working itself has costs. So whatever you're doing, you have to be able to cover those costs, and it has to be worth your time. if you give people unconditional access to resources, presumably that will push up their reservation wage. So there should be, one would predict, some effects on wages and potentially on bargaining power more generally, because workers would have more ability to turn down a job. And this is the argument Andy Stern makes. Eric Olin Wright actually makes it in an earlier Boston Review piece. He's a sociologist at University of Wisconsin. So as I said in response to the last question, there's what theory would predict, and then there's what happens on the ground. And we don't really know what happens on the ground. People are studying it. Some people will be able to enter the labor market more easily once they have, if you gave them unconditional resources. If you think you're not able to afford childcare or transportation, like the basic income might give you enough resources to afford that, and then it would spark greater labor market participation. Other people might withdraw from the labor market and say, whatever, I've got $1,000 a month now, I'm just going to live on that and not have to go to a job anymore. Labor economists, the norm in the fields, I'm not a labor economist, but I, sort of read them a fair bit. The norm in the field is like just not to make predictions about that sort of thing, because we can't understand how people are going to respond to an external stimulus. We should just go study how they would respond. And that's sort of where I am. We can't presume it's going to empower workers. The bigger issue, though, is that how do you actually form a collective bargaining unit in the US? You have to unionize. And that is an incredibly resource-intensive and emotionally intensive process. And there are enormous collective action problems to workers actually unionizing. Yes, a basic income would maybe make it marginally easier for them to organize because they'd have a greater ability to go on strike. But I don't see how it does anything to alter the social dynamics of a unionization effort and the difficulty of getting workers to act in a concerted manner. And in some ways might make it more difficult by giving some workers an ability to survive without a union. So Andy Stern says in his book this would really spark greater unionization. I don't see it. But again, it's something that you would want to be able to study, and we just don't have great data on it.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
a terrific and stimulating presentation. So thank you, Brishen, for your talk.
Thanks so much.